The philosophy wars that started in ancient China and never ended, Confucius to communism in 20 minutes. You've been told that communism came from Marx and Russia. Pure Western invention, applied to an Eastern bloc. But what if I told you the deepest roots of communist thinking were already buried in Chinese philosophy for 2,000 years before Marx wrote a single page? And that understanding this connection changes everything about how we interpret the Cold War itself, not as a clash of West versus East, but as two competing visions of order that both trace back to the same ancient Chinese debates about power, duty, and human nature. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see the Cold War through a completely different lens. If you lived through the Cold War, you know it felt like an ideological war. Capitalism against communism, freedom against oppression. But historians have largely missed something crucial. The philosophical scaffolding holding up both systems was already being debated in ancient China. And if you want to understand why the Cold War played out the way it did, why certain nations aligned as they did, why the conflict felt so absolute, you need to trace this thread backward. Before we go further, I want to mention something. There's a complete guide in the description that breaks down the philosophical mechanisms behind these ideas, the signals and patterns that connect ancient Confucianism to 20th century communist ideology in ways most history books gloss over entirely. It's not free, and it's deliberately deeper than what we can cover here. But if you're serious about understanding this era, it's worth your time. Look, subscribe if you haven't already. And here's something I'd genuinely like to know. Which era of the Cold War shaped your worldview the most? Drop that in the comments. I read them, and I'm curious how people who lived through this remember it now that we have hindsight. Hold on, there's a critical distinction I need you to understand right from the start. When we say communism, most people think of the brutal regimes of Stalin or Mao. But the word itself, and the philosophical system it describes, contains something much older. Confucius, writing around 500 BC, was preoccupied with a single question: how do you create a stable society when human beings are naturally selfish and power-hungry? His answer wasn't what you'd expect. He didn't say, let people be free and they'll figure it out. He said something closer to this: impose a strict moral hierarchy. A father rules the family. A ruler rules the state. Everyone has a role. Everyone has duties. If everyone accepts their position and fulfills their obligations perfectly, harmony emerges. Not freedom, harmony through submission to a moral order. Now flip forward 2,000 years. Marx is writing in Victorian England, and he's asking almost the same question. How do you create a stable society? But his answer is inverted. Remove hierarchy entirely. Abolish class distinction. Create a system where everyone contributes according to their ability and receives according to their need. No rulers, no ruled, classless society, perfect equality. Sounds opposite to Confucius, right? Different answer to the same problem. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is why I want your full attention. Both systems assume that human beings, left to their own devices, will destroy social order. Both demand total reorganization of society around a moral principle. Both require the individual to subordinate personal desire to collective harmony. Confucius calls it duty to the hierarchy. Marx calls it duty to the classless future. The vocabulary is different. The underlying structure is almost identical. And this matters for the Cold War because when communist ideology reached China in the early 20th century, it didn't arrive as something alien, it arrived as something familiar, a reinvention of an old game using modern language. Mao Zedong and the early Chinese communists weren't abandoning Chinese philosophy. They were adapting it. They were saying, forget the emperor, forget the Confucian scholar official class, but keep the moral order. Keep the sense that individual desire must be subordinated to collective purpose. Keep the hierarchy of duty. Just reorganize it around the workers' state instead of the imperial court. That's why the Chinese Revolution felt so native, so organic to Chinese people, in a way Western observers often didn't understand. It wasn't foreign ideology imposed on a resistant population. It was a modernization of an ancient order. The structure was already in the cultural DNA. But this creates a problem. If both Confucianism and communism are fundamentally about organizing human beings into a moral hierarchy where individual desires are subordinated to collective order, then the real philosophical war wasn't between East and West, it was internal. It was between different visions of what that hierarchy should be, who should enforce it, and what moral principle should hold it together. And that becomes the key to understanding why the Cold War played out the way it did in Asia, why Korea split, why China didn't simply become a Soviet satellite, why the Sino-Soviet split happened at all. The West saw communism as an invasion from Moscow, a monolithic bloc spreading across Asia. But from inside the Chinese philosophical tradition, something far more complex was occurring. The real question wasn't capitalism versus communism. It was which version of the moral order would dominate East Asia, the Confucian order updated through Soviet collectivism, or the Confucian order updated through Chinese peasant revolution and Maoist adaptation. That wasn't an ideological detail, that was everything. Mao had won China through peasant mobilization, not industrial proletariat revolution. Marx himself had predicted this would never happen. The working class in cities was supposed to lead the revolution. Instead, a revolutionary leader had organized farmers in the countryside and defeated the nationalists in 1949. That violation of Marxist doctrine troubled Moscow immediately. Stalin had backed Chiang Kai-shek for years, not Mao. When Mao won anyway, Stalin's first instinct was control, not celebration. Moscow wanted Beijing to behave like Warsaw or Prague, obedient, subordinate, a satellite state. But Mao had a different inheritance to draw on. When he looked back at Chinese history, he didn't see just Marx. He saw Confucius. He saw the classical Chinese idea of virtue as the foundation of legitimate power. A ruler who possessed virtue commanded loyalty naturally. A ruler who lacked it would eventually fall. Confucius had never written about industrial revolution or class warfare. He'd written about moral example, about the proper ordering of relationships, about hierarchy justified by merit and virtue, not bloodline alone. Mao grafted Marx onto this older framework. The peasant was virtuous, the imperialist was corrupted, the revolution was restoring moral order to China. That wasn't how Moscow thought. Moscow thought in terms of party discipline, central planning, and allegiance to the Soviet Communist International. When Mao went to Moscow in 1950, he waited in Stalin's anteroom for weeks, a deliberate humiliation. Stalin made him wait, because Beijing was a prize to be managed, not a partner to be respected. Their alliance was necessary on paper, the Treaty of Mutual Defense signed in February 1950, but it was hollow from the start. Two different visions of communism, two different philosophical roots, both claiming to speak for world revolution. The Korean War changed everything. When North Korea invaded the South in June 1950, Stalin had given permission. He believed America wouldn't intervene. He was wrong. President Truman committed U.S. forces within days. General Douglas MacArthur pushed north so aggressively that by October, American forces were approaching the Yalu River, the border between Korea and China. Mao sent warnings through diplomatic channels. Ignore them, and China would enter the war. Washington dismissed the threat as bluffing. In late October 1950, Chinese forces crossed the Yalu in massive numbers. Estimates varied, but at least 300,000 troops, possibly 500,000. They caught MacArthur's advancing columns by surprise. The American offensive collapsed. For Mao, this wasn't just military strategy. It was a demonstration of Chinese power and independence. China could act unilaterally. China didn't need Stalin's permission or command. That assertion of autonomy planted the seeds of the Sino-Soviet split, though no one fully grasped it yet. Hold on. Before we continue, I need you to focus on something critical. This split between Beijing and Moscow. It didn't happen because of personalities or quarrels. It happened because two different philosophical traditions were trying to inhabit the same ideology. The complete guide that breaks down exactly how Marxism transformed when it crossed into Confucian civilization is in the description and pinned below. That guide shows you the real mechanism behind communist fracture, not just the surface events. You'll see why this philosophical collision shaped the next 4 decades of Cold War strategy. It's not available for free. It's a paid resource, but it's where the actual answers are. The war froze along roughly the 38th parallel again, the same line that had divided Korea since 1945. But the cost had been immense. Hundreds of thousands dead on both sides. American public opinion soured. MacArthur demanded escalation, even nuclear weapons. Truman refused and eventually fired him. The fighting continued in a grinding stalemate for 2 more years, until an armistice in July 1953, just months after Stalin's death. That's the critical detail nobody emphasizes. Stalin died in March 1953. The moment he was gone, the entire calculation changed. His successor as General Secretary, Nikita Khrushchev, took a very different approach. Khrushchev wanted peaceful coexistence with the West. He wanted to reduce military spending, to compete economically and diplomatically, rather than through endless proxy wars. That shift created space for Mao to maneuver independently. By 1954, China was already making its own foreign policy moves, hosting the Geneva Conference on Indochina, without asking Moscow's permission first. The partnership that had seemed so unified in 1950 was fragmenting. Mao resented Soviet superiority. Khrushchev distrusted Mao's unpredictability and peasant-based ideology. And underneath it all ran the older current, the difference between how Russia understood communism and how China understood it. Russia had industrialized first. Russia saw communism as the next stage of industrial development. China had skipped industrialization and gone straight to communist revolution through peasant mobilization. Those two paths couldn't be reconciled by ideology alone. They required fundamentally different visions of what communism meant. By the mid-1950s, the cracks were visible to anyone paying attention. Moscow and Beijing had begun to argue, not in public yet, but in private letters, in theoretical journals, in pointed speeches delivered at international conferences. The arguments were couched in Marxist language, but they were fundamentally about power, territory, and the right to define what communism actually meant. Khrushchev made his first major miscalculation in 1956. At the 20th Party Congress in Moscow, he delivered what became known as the secret speech, a denunciation of Stalin's terror, his personality cult, his paranoia. The speech was supposed to stay confidential. It didn't. Word spread. Polish and Hungarian communists heard about it and believed the Soviet Union might actually allow reform within the Eastern Bloc. Hungary exploded that October. Students and workers took to the streets demanding real change, demanding an end to Soviet domination. For a moment, it seemed possible. The Hungarian government, sensing the mood, announced it would withdraw from the Warsaw Pact and declare neutrality. Khrushchev's response was swift and brutal. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest. Thousands died. The Hungarian Revolution was crushed, and the message was unmistakable. Reform was permitted only if Moscow approved it. Anything beyond that would be answered with force. Mao watched this carefully. He had supported Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin, at first, but the Hungarian intervention confirmed something Mao had suspected. Khrushchev was weak. Weak leaders used tanks when they couldn't win arguments. A truly confident communist superpower wouldn't need to invade to maintain control. From Beijing's perspective, Khrushchev was also making ideological mistakes. He spoke of peaceful coexistence, of competing with capitalism through economic development rather than revolutionary struggle. But capitalism, Mao argued, was inherently aggressive. It could not be reformed or competed with. It had to be defeated, and the instrument of that defeat would be the peasantry of Asia and Africa, not the industrial working class of Europe and America. This wasn't merely theoretical posturing. It was a fundamental disagreement about how history worked. Russia had become a status quo power, intent on managing the existing international system and preventing nuclear war. China saw itself as a revolutionary force that would eventually reshape the entire world. Those positions couldn't coexist indefinitely. Pause here. I need to emphasize something crucial for understanding what comes next. The Sino-Soviet split wasn't driven by one man's personality or one bad decision. It emerged from structural contradictions. Two communist nations with different histories, different geographies, different security concerns, and different readings of Marxist doctrine. These weren't disagreements that could be fixed through better diplomacy or warmer personal relationships. They were rooted in how each nation understood its own revolution and its role in the world. By 1959, the split had become public. The two nations stopped pretending to get along. Soviet technicians who had been helping develop China's nuclear program were withdrawn. Khrushchev refused to share nuclear weapons technology or to provide unconditional military support. From Mao's perspective, this was betrayal. From Khrushchev's, It was caution. He didn't want China developing nuclear weapons that might be used recklessly. The economic ties frayed. Trade between the two countries dropped sharply. The shared enemy, the United States and its Western allies, remained, but it was no longer enough to hold them together. Enemies of your enemy sometimes become your own adversaries once the original threat diminishes or changes shape. What made this split genuinely significant for global Cold War dynamics was its timing and its publicity. By the early 1960s, the communist world was no longer monolithic. It had fractured into competing camps. You had the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites. You had China, allied with Albania and parts of Southeast Asia. You had Yugoslavia, which had split from the Soviet orbit a decade earlier and was charting its own course. And you had various communist parties worldwide, caught between Moscow and Beijing, each trying to decide which center of power to follow. American policymakers initially missed the importance of this development. Many in Washington assumed the entire communist world was unified, coordinating global subversion from a central command. The reality was far messier. Communism had fragmented, but understanding that fragmentation and using it strategically would take years. The split between Moscow and Beijing created openings that American strategists would eventually learn to exploit. But that lesson came later, often through trial and error. In the immediate aftermath of the Sino-Soviet rift, the Kennedy administration was consumed with other crises. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, the Berlin Wall rising in August of that same year, the space race, which had humiliated American pride after Sputnik and Gagarin's orbital flight. These were the headlines that dominated Washington's focus. The communist world's internal divisions were largely treated as a secondary concern, something to monitor but not yet to weaponize. That would change, but not before another catastrophe nearly pushed the world toward nuclear war. Hold on, I need you to set aside everything else for just a moment. What you're about to hear shaped the entire second half of the Cold War, and it hinged on information that only became fully declassified decades later. Our complete guide on the intelligence frameworks and decision-making processes that define this era is available in the description, along with the pinned comment below. That resource goes into the technical details of how intelligence agencies misread situations, how miscalculation nearly became extinction, and what finally taught both superpowers to communicate when stakes climbed this high. It's a paid guide, and it's where the full mechanisms of Cold War crisis management are laid bare. In October 1962, American U-2 spy planes photographed Soviet missile installations in Cuba. Kennedy's national security team learned that nuclear warheads capable of reaching American cities were being positioned 90 miles off the Florida coast. The discovery triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days that brought the superpowers closer to open nuclear conflict than any other moment in the Cold War. The crisis revealed how dangerously the two sides misunderstood each other's intentions and red lines. Nikita Khrushchev had authorized the deployment partly to protect Castro's Cuba from American invasion, partly to close what he saw as a missile gap favoring the United States. Kennedy had run for office pledging to close that same gap in America's favor. Both leaders believed they were correcting an imbalance. Neither fully grasped how the other would perceive the move. Kennedy went on television on October 22nd to inform Americans that a naval quarantine of Cuba was being imposed. Soviet ships carrying weapons would not be allowed to pass. The language was deliberate, quarantine rather than blockade, since a blockade is technically an act of war under international law. But the meaning was unmistakable. American naval vessels would intercept Soviet freighters. Confrontation was imminent. For 6 days, neither side fully backed down. Khrushchev sent letters alternating between defiant rhetoric and hints that a deal might be possible. XCOM, Kennedy's ad hoc advisory committee, debated whether airstrikes on the missile sites should precede a full invasion. Military planners drafted invasion scenarios. War seemed not merely possible but probable to many participants in those meetings. What ultimately resolved the crisis was not public negotiation, but secret diplomacy. Attorney General Robert Kennedy met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin. The message was blunt. The United States would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey if the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles from Cuba. Turkey's removal had to remain covert. Public knowledge of such a swap would humiliate Khrushchev domestically, and anger NATO allies who would see their security traded away without consultation. On October 28, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles would be withdrawn. The crisis had ended, but the near catastrophe had shaken both capitals profoundly. Kennedy and Khrushchev had looked into the nuclear abyss. Neither wanted to return there. The crisis produced a strange geopolitical outcome. It demonstrated that nuclear superpowers could not afford direct military confrontation. Proxy conflicts would remain acceptable, but direct war risked extinction. This realization led, in 1963, to the installation of a hotline between the White House and the Kremlin, allowing leaders to communicate directly during crises. It was red telephone in mythology, though actually a secure teleprinter system. The symbolism mattered as much as the technology. Both sides began, gradually, to accept certain rules of engagement. You could support proxies, you could compete in the space race, you could spread propaganda and conduct espionage. But you could not allow those competitions to escalate into direct nuclear exchange. The Eisenhower administration had called this framework massive retaliation. Kennedy reframed it as flexible response, but the underlying calculus remained the same. Nuclear war was unwinnable, so it must be made unthinkable. That framework held, barely, throughout the mid-1960s, but Vietnam was about to test it in ways that neither Moscow nor Washington had anticipated. The conflict in Southeast Asia was not, in American eyes, a regional dispute over colonial independence. It was a test of American credibility. If the United States abandoned South Vietnam to communist expansion, Allied governments from Japan to West Germany would lose faith in American security guarantees. Dominoes would fall. That was the operative assumption. The problem was that Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of North Vietnam, was not a Soviet puppet. He was a nationalist first. Moscow and Beijing supported him militarily, but Ho had his own vision for a unified Vietnam free from foreign interference. American policymakers did not fully grasp this distinction. They saw communism as a monolith controlled from Moscow. They missed the fractures within the communist world. Soviet and Chinese interests in Vietnam were not identical, and North Vietnamese interests were not identical to either. In August 1964, 2 American destroyers reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The first incident likely happened. The second almost certainly did not, but it gave the Johnson administration the justification it needed. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution with almost no dissent, granting the president a blank check to wage war without a formal declaration. By March 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder began, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that would last 3 years. American ground forces followed. 50,000 troops by the end of 1965, nearly 185,000 by 1966, 500,000 by 1968. The war consumed resources and attention at a scale that shocked the American public. Draftees, many of them 19-year-olds with no choice in the matter, were shipped to a jungle they did not understand to fight an enemy that could not be defeated by conventional means. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army did not engage in large-scale conventional battles. They used tunnels, booby traps, and ambushes. American firepower could destroy villages. It could not destroy an idea. Body counts mounted, but progress remained elusive. McNamara's metrics, kill ratios, tonnage dropped, villages pacified, could not measure the actual outcome. A war that could not be won militarily because the war was ultimately political. Back home, opposition grew. College students protested the draft. Mothers questioned why their sons were dying for a place they could not find on a map. The Tet Offensive of January 1968, a coordinated North Vietnamese assault across South Vietnam, was a military defeat for the North. American and South Vietnamese forces repelled it decisively. But it was a psychological victory. American television showed the offensive live. Millions watched battles unfold in their living rooms. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted newsman in America, reported from Vietnam and concluded that the war was unwinnable. President Johnson, watching Cronkite's assessment, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." He announced in March 1968 that he would not seek re-election. Richard Nixon, promising peace with honor, won the presidency that November. Honor meant something specific to Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. It meant that America could not simply withdraw. That would be a humiliation. Instead, the strategy shifted toward Vietnamization, training South Vietnamese forces to fight the war themselves, while Americans gradually withdrew. In practice, it meant the war continued under a different banner. Before we take a step back here, keep this in mind. The Vietnam War was the first American conflict where the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Previous wars had clear endpoints. Korea had an armistice. Earlier conflicts had surrender ceremonies. Vietnam simply ended when Americans left. That ambiguity shaped everything that followed, including how the nation understood its own power. If you want to understand how Vietnam fractured American confidence in institutions, how it destroyed trust in government, and why the Cold War's second half felt so different from its first, the full architecture of that collapse is laid out in our complete guide. It's available in the description, pinned to the top, and explores how perception of American invincibility was dismantled in real time. It is a paid guide, designed for deep understanding. The wars in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, ultimately cost 58,000 American lives. North Vietnam and the Viet Cong suffered over 1 million deaths. Millions of civilians were displaced. The outcome, North Vietnam, communist, unified the country in 1975, 2 years after American forces withdrew. The memorial stands today as testimony to a war America did not win and could not afford to lose. 58,000 names carved into black granite, each one a life that ended in a place most Americans couldn't locate on a map when the war began. Yet the real cost wasn't measured only in deaths. Vietnam shattered something intangible but real, the assumption that American military power was invincible. Before Vietnam, that belief had survived Korea's stalemate, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the space race's early Soviet victories. Americans still believed, fundamentally, that their system worked better, that their weapons were superior, that their will would ultimately prevail. Vietnam proved otherwise. It proved that will alone couldn't overcome terrain, climate, political will on the enemy's side, or the exhaustion of the home front. It proved that the American military, for all its technological advantage, couldn't defeat an opponent who refused to surrender in conventional ways. It proved that a superpower could lose. That revelation rippled outward. If America could lose in Vietnam, what else was vulnerable? Could the Soviets catch up in nuclear weapons? Could they surpass America economically? Could Soviet ideology ultimately triumph, as communists claimed it must? The confidence that had carried America through the first half of the Cold War, the certainty that history was on our side, that certainty evaporated in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And this is where the secret I promised you at the beginning finally emerges. The reason the Cold War's second half felt so different from its first wasn't about weapons or doctrines or even ideology anymore. It was about psychology. It was about American doubt. Vietnam didn't just end a war. It ended an era of American psychological dominance. The Soviets hadn't defeated America militarily in any direct conflict, but Vietnam had shown that America could defeat itself, through miscalculation, through overconfidence, through the inability to adapt strategy when initial plans failed. That realization changed how Americans saw themselves and how the Soviet Union saw America. The détente that followed, the arms control treaties, the Helsinki Accords, the assumption that the two superpowers could coexist, all of that emerged from a moment of American weakness, not Soviet strength. When Reagan arrived in 1981, the project wasn't to defeat a resurgent Soviet Union. It was to restore American belief in American power. The military buildup, the rhetoric of confrontation, even the space shuttle program. These were partly about actual military advantage, yes, but they were equally about psychology, about telling Americans again that they could win. The Cold War didn't end because the Soviet Union ran out of missiles. It ended because the Soviet Union had always been, at its core, a system sustained by the belief that it represented the future. By the 1980s, that belief had collapsed from within, but America had needed Vietnam, and the decade of doubt that followed it, to understand that belief, whether Soviet or American, was always the real battlefield. The physical wars matter: Korea, Vietnam, the proxy conflicts in Africa and Central America. The missiles matter: the spy satellites and the submarines and the nuclear arsenals. But underneath all of that was a simpler, more human question. Which system could its own people believe in? Which could sustain that belief across generations? Which could survive failure and doubt and still convince itself of its own rightness? America's answer came not from its weapons or its leaders alone, but from the willingness of its people to correct course, to question themselves, to admit mistakes and survive them. Vietnam was that correction, that admission. The Cold War didn't end because America had better missiles in 1989 than in 1975. It ended because Americans had learned, painfully and at terrible cost, that power without wisdom is temporary. Certainty without humility is fatal. That's the lesson Vietnam carved into the second half of the Cold War, and frankly, into American identity itself. It's something worth remembering when we face conflicts and choices today. Thank you for following this entire Cold War story with me, from the rubble of 1945 all the way through the fall of the wall. If you watched because you lived through these decades and wanted clarity, I hope this has delivered it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next video in this series, and if there's a Cold War era or moment you'd still like to understand, leave a comment below, turn on notifications, and we'll continue this journey together.